Okay, well, I have no idea what happened with the audio of the last video. That was a mess. But hopefully, recording on this thing, my tablet, will give better results. Apparently, don't record on my laptop. Lesson learned. So, let's talk about Rhythm of War Part 1. There is so much to talk about here. I have no idea if this is going to be one video or two. I'm going to guess it'll have to be two because there's just so much. So, let's start as I have taken a habit, I've formed a habit of doing. Let's start with the characters. A lot of very interesting stuff going on here with Kaladin and Shallan, as usual. Not a lot going on with Dalinar yet, but Cal and Shallan definitely. And also some very, very interesting stuff with Venli I want to talk about. But let's start with Kaladin, probably. That seems to make the most sense. So, Kaladin has been retired, I guess, by Dalinar due to his. I I don't want to say PTSD. Like we're making it out like they're talking about it as though they're talking about PTSD, but I don't think that's what Kaladin has. Like I don't. I mean, Kaladin has depression. That's a definite fact, and that's a very strong supporting factor in why he is unable to stay on the front lines. But a bigger issue is, I think, his massive anxiety over the safety of others around him. Um, Now, I don't know much about PTSD. That could be a symptom of it, I guess. But I don't think in Kaladin's case that it is. I think that's just who Kaladin is as a person. He's just always been obsessed with protecting everyone around him. And if I'm right, as I predicted at the end of the previous book, if I'm right that Cal's fourth ideal is going to have to be something along the lines of I can't be responsible for everyone, like I can't blame myself for everyone's deaths, then him overcoming his issues, his personal issues in this book, is going to coincide with him swearing the fourth ideal, which is going to be nice. I like that idea. It's why I kind of like surge binding as a magic system, because it necessitates that characters keep growing, because character growth is the only way for them to also advance in power in this world's magic system, which I think is a really, really neat idea, and one that I'm shocked I haven't seen before. It's just such an obvious idea now that I'm reading it. I'm like, oh, that's like the ideal magic system for a character-driven story. And it doesn't feel cheesy at all, which I feel like if you just described it to me, I would think it would, but it really doesn't. Anyway, I've gotten off topic here. Kaladin. Kaladin is retired and he's going to try to be a surgeon again with his dad, and he's not happy about it. Like, he responded to the proposal with some degree of horror, which is interesting. I'm curious to see how that goes. I think Cal would be a good surgeon, but I don't think he'd be happy being a surgeon. So we'll see how long that lasts. First of all, I just want to say, personally, I think it would be really interesting and a really bold narrative decision on Brandon's part if Cal just stayed a surgeon for the rest of the series. Like if one of our main characters genuinely did retire from combat this early in the series, that would be a very interesting decision. But I don't think it's what's going to happen. I am like 95% sure that by the end of this book, Kaladin will be back in action. Which again, is fine. I won't mind if it happens. I just sort of keep wondering about how interesting it would be to not do that. The more interesting stuff that happens here, I mean, not to say that Kaladin's depression and the stuff that he's dealing with right now aren't interesting, because they are, but I also need to wait and see how they play out before I can comment on it too much. What I find more interesting right now is the interaction between Kaladin and Moash that happens early on here. So Moash has a unexpected nihilism now. I kind of assumed that Moash would be all about like, ooh, liberation from oppression as like a character motivation, which would be a very good, frankly, character motivation to side with the singers, because they are literally slaves who are rebelling. But no, his motivation is nihilism, which, interesting choice. We'll see where that goes. I feel like that's less interesting of a motivation than what I just said. I feel like it would be more interesting if he was genuinely ideologically of the belief that the singers have a moral right to their fight, which I also agree with, and therefore concluded he had to side with them, which I don't necessarily agree with, but it, like I said, it would be an interesting, a more nuanced, I think, motivation for him as a villain, quote unquote, than just, oh, he thinks life is pointless and has no meaning. But it is what it is. This is the Moash we've got. We have, and that's not to say that this is like a missed opportunity necessarily, because there are absolutely other characters in here who are filling that role of liberators. And key among them is Venli. Venli is a fascinating character to me now, because Venli wants, essentially, both sides to lose. Like, she's not, unlike Ralain, who has pretty definitively sided with the humans against the singers, Venli has not. Venli very much still views the humans as oppressors and evil, which, yes, true, correct. They are. In this, like, that is absolutely a valid and correct point of view for any singer to have. But she also views the fused the same way. And she's also right about that. Like, there's a moment here where Leshwi promises her that, oh, once we defeat all the humans, the fused will retreat back into oblivion or whatever, and then you guys will get to have your own civilization. And Venli, I think correctly, guesses that that's not going to happen. The fused don't seem like the type to give up power. And so Venli is in an interesting position of trying to free her people both from the external colonial oppression of the humans and from the, frankly, at this point in history, almost equally external oppression of the fused. Because while the fused do belong theoretically to the same species as the modern singers, they are so far removed in terms of both time and power and moral goals from the general singer population that they might as well be a second set of essentially foreign colonizers who have conquered the singers. And I like that. I like this angle to the story. I like the fact that Venli isn't being forced to choose between odium or humanity, the way that Ralain was. Venli is allowed the space to hate both, which I think is the correct position here. And really, I kind of feel like Moash should have maybe had a similar opinion. Like, I'm not sure what's going on with Moesh's character arc at the moment. But Venli's is going fantastically. I mean, it's going poorly for her right now. She's not having a good time, but it is going fantastically for me as a reader because I'm enjoying it. And I think it's going to be. I think Venli is going to be a very, very, very interesting character to watch for going forward. Um, I'm still shocked by the way that that Eshonai was killed like that. I was so sure that Eshonai was going to be our primary singer point of view, and yet, nope. Anyway, that's it for Venli and Kaladin's character arcs. Let's talk about Shallan. Shallan is in an interesting place right now. I am really, really enjoying every single scene with Shallan. Or, should I say, with the three. Because that is what Shallan is calling themselves now. Shallan has fully embraced the idea that there are three personas inside of her, which are Shallan, Radiant, and Veil, and she is referring to herself in the plural, and she lets different personas take over at different moments, and even after all this time, it is still not clear to me if this is a thing that she did with her light weaving. Like, did she soul cast herself into these personalities originally? Essentially? Or if it's just, just regular dissociative identity disorder. Like, would Veil and Radiant exist if Shallan wasn't a light weaver, is my question, I guess. That remains unanswered. It remains unclear to me. I don't think it matters much at this point because she's fully embraced her nature as a threefold person, which I find perfectly fine, and I actually really I enjoy reading it, but I also think that's a totally. I don't think there's anything wrong with that. Like, I don't think that this is an issue that Shallan needs to cure, quote unquote. I feel like they're getting along just fine like this. Of course, Shallan has other issues she needs to deal with, such as the fact that she still has a bunch of repressed memories, which is interesting. That I'm realizing now that Words of Radiance didn't actually give us the entirety of Shallan's backstory. There's some missing stuff that Shallan still doesn't remember. So that's something she needs to deal with. But the whole having three personalities thing, I think, is totally okay. I don't really see an issue with it. The only way in which it really matters, if this is regular, quote unquote, real world DID, or an effect of her light weaving, is that if it's regular DID, then obviously there's a higher standard of accuracy that Sanderson has to write to. But it's not something I'm going to be able to identify because I know very little about DID. I have not read up on much on it. I'm not particularly well versed in it. And unlike some of the other stuff that these books have dealt with, I also don't really know anyone who has it, so I can't really speak to the accuracy. I can only say that I am very much enjoying reading Shallan's chapters here. She remains my favorite character. And her story arc is about to go in a very interesting direction because she is committing more and more to the Ghost Bloods, I think. In particular, both the Veil and the Shallan personas seem inclined to work with the Ghost Bloods. It's not surprising that Veil does. It's a little surprising that Shallan does, but it also makes sense given that what they offer is knowledge and secrets, which is kind of Shallan's thing. A part of me is unsure. Like, a part of me obviously wants characters to make the best decisions, so I'm like, oh no, Shallan, stop working with the Ghostbloods. That's definitely a bad choice that'll come back to bite you in the ass. But then a different part of me is like, no, if she stops working with the Ghostbloods, I won't get to learn anything more about the Ghostbloods, and I want to. And also, it provides interesting conflict for the story. So I have a feeling right now that the Shallan portion of this particular book is going to be especially interesting to read. I'm really like specifically looking forward to any Shallan chapters in the future. Okay, what else? Navani. Navani is also a character with some interesting stuff going on here. So Navani has this whole thing where she doesn't think of herself as a scientist. She thinks of herself as an enabler of scientists and scholars. She's a patron of scholarship rather than a scholar herself. And it's very clear, it's a bit heavy-handed really, it's very clear that that is not the case, that she is in fact an incredibly talented scholar. And I'm assuming that her arc in this book, which is the first book where she seems to be a major character, is going to be about coming to terms with that, about accepting, about learning to value her actual scholarly contributions instead of just thinking of herself as a patron of scholarship. This is where the prologue comes in. The prologue is, once again, as it always is, set on the night of Gavilar's assassination. And what we learn here is that Gavilar, in addition to being a horrible person who wanted to end the world for ideological reasons, was also a truly horrifically bad husband and seemingly a terrible father as well, based on how he talks about his children. I don't think Elhokar or Yasna ever really became aware of that. I think Navani kept it from them, like just how much basically contempt their father had for them. But he was not a loving father by any stretch of the imagination. He was a horrible person. But he was a person who apparently wanted immortality of a sort, and that can't help but make me wonder, did he succeed? Is Gavilar Kholin really dead? Or does he continue to exist in some form? Probably not as a mortal man, but perhaps as some kind of cognitive shadow? I feel like that might be what we're building towards here, actually. Yeah, that's I think that's all the major character beats here. Let's talk about some plot stuff that happens here and some thematic stuff. So I've already talked about the main theme that's going on here, which is the whole Venli and the freedom of the singers thing. But I think there's actually a bit more to talk about there. That's less focused on Venli herself and more just generally. So with the singers, what Sanderson is doing is something very interesting. A lot of fantasy, especially recent fantasy in the 21st century, has completely discarded the idea of Dark Lords, and especially of Dark Lords who have like a specific race that is their entire army. Essentially orcs. There are no orcs in much of contemporary fantasy. Or if there are orcs, they're just another sapient species, just like humans. And I feel like Sanderson is successfully having his cake and eating it too, because the singers very much are the army of an all-powerful Dark Lord, meaning Odium, but they are also fully humanized and not treated as fundamentally evil. And in fact, I would say that the singers generally have been portrayed as more morally sound than humans on average. Of course, then there are the fused, and the fused sort of fill in the role of the, at least that's what I thought for a while, is that the fused would fill in the role of the evil shock troops. Like they are the guys we can kill with impunity because we know they're evil. But no, that's not them either, because the fused also have a variety of motivations. Leshwi and Lezian and Raboniel are completely different characters with wildly different moral codes, wildly different motivations, and wildly different levels of how bad I would feel if they died. And I think that Sanderson is sort of aggressively refusing in Stormlight Archive to ever provide an easy villain, with the exception of Amaram and Thaddeus. In my opinion, Amaram and Thaddeus kind of stuck out from the rest of the cast of Stormlight Archive as being sort of these cartoonishly evil characters, which I don't think is unbelievable. I think they, as characters, make sense and are realistic. They're just also kind of a less interesting kind of villain than what we're getting right now in Rhythm of War, at least so far. Speaking of villains, the other, of course, major villain that is still at play is Taravangian. Taravangian, who is trying to sacrifice the world to Odium in order to preserve Kharbranth. So, I'm not sure how that's going to go. Taravangian seems resigned to his own death at this point, and I don't think that's going to happen. I feel like Taravangian is too interesting of a character, with motivations so fascinating and complex and interesting, and I cannot imagine Sanderson getting rid of him this early in the series. I have a feeling that Taravangian is going to be sticking with us for a very long time, in some form. However, I do expect that whatever happens next, probably right now in part 2, is going to massively alter the trajectory of his character forever. Because he is about to openly side with Odium and betray everyone else. And while I am reasonably certain he will survive, I am not at all certain where this will leave him or what his role in the future is going to end up being. He is definitely a character I am watching with rapt attention. What else can I talk about here? I mean, there's so much to talk about here. Let's pick a random thing out of the hat. Yasna. Yasna wants to abolish slavery in Alethkar. This is obviously a good thing, and obviously something that needs to be done immediately. There can be no delays in something like this. You cannot do this gradually. It must be done immediately. It is a moral imperative. However, Dalinar disagrees. And I think that the fact that Dalinar opposes the abolition of slavery because it would shake up the status quo too much, essentially, is very in character. Dalinar is genuinely a good person, but he is also a person who is thoroughly immersed in the current status quo. While he is in some ways a radical, in many other ways, he is unable or unwilling to imagine a truly different world. His solutions, while the problems that he perceives when others do not are radical, his perception of problems that need solving is radical, the solutions he proposes tend not to be. This is something that we saw way back in Book 1. I talked in Book 1 how Dalinar just doesn't see Dark Eyes as fully human. That's not something that he would ever admit. That's not something that he is consciously aware of, but on some level it's true. Because Dalinar knew about Sadeas' treatment of the Bridgemen, and yet he still thought that deep down Sadeas was an honorable man. If Dalinar had truly viewed the Dark Eyes as human beings with full, essentially human rights of the same kind that he ascribes to Light Eyes, he would never have fallen for Sadeas' trap, because he would have been unable to imagine that Sadeas could be a decent person based on how he treats Dark Eyes. But because they're Dark Eyes and slaves, it just kind of makes sense to treat them that way. Like, Dalinar never would. He thinks it's bad, but he wouldn't do it. Yeah, he wouldn't do it. But he won't, like, morally condemn Sadeas for doing it, you know? And I feel like this is kind of a continuation of that theme, which is that Dalinar is very thoroughly enmeshed in his own class position and has trouble sometimes really acknowledging the fact that the people that his society has oppressed in such a thorough way are actually people who deserve to be treated that way. I think this is also kind of the reason why he isn't the one, despite being a bondsmith and being all about peace and bringing people together, he is not the one arguing for peace with the Singers. Only Kaladin is arguing that, because of our main human cast, Kaladin is the only one who acknowledges Singers as people, really, rather than just monsters. And that makes sense, because he's been dehumanized. He knows what it's like. Dalinar does not. And Dalinar cannot. And I'm hoping that this is something that Dalinar overcomes going forward. But it's going to be very difficult for him to do so, because these are deeply, deeply entrenched, like, class-based opinions that sort of come naturally with the material positionality of his class. So I'm curious to see if he manages to overcome that one. What else is going on here? I mean, again, so much, but let's talk about a couple of plot things. So we have two big Cosmere chapters here. We have Zahel, aka Vasher, all but confirming that he's Vasher to Kaladin. He doesn't actually say that he's Vasher, but at this point it's really, really obvious that he is. And I really, really like in that chapter how Vasher talks about he sort of incorporated the magic of Roshar, and specifically the Spren, into his own highly scientific approach to investiture, and he's like had to reclassify everything because the Spren mess up all of his previous classifications. I really like that. But we don't really learn that much here from him, apart from the fact that the fused work kind of the same way that someone like Vasher does, in terms of being a spirit kind of nailed to a body in a weird way. I'm sure that everything he says here is going to be massively important to figuring out a way to actually win this fight, but as of right now, I don't know what shape that's going to take. So I'm not going to talk too much about all the stuff he talked about here, which is all highly technical and very interesting, and I do have thoughts on it, but I don't think it's very interesting for me to just talk about the various mechanics of the magic system right now. And now I'm going to be a hypocrite, because now I am going to talk about the mechanics a bit, because now we get to the other major revelation chapter here, which is Mraiz finally telling Shallan what the Ghostbloods are about. The Ghostbloods, it turns out, want to transport and presumably trade, Stormlight to other Cosmere worlds. they mention Scadrial, Nolthis, and Taldane, I believe. I haven't read White Sand yet, so I don't know much about Taldane. But I do find myself wondering, what possible use would Stormlight be on Nolthis or Scadrial? Like, why would you care? Why would you want to have it there? Who on those worlds would want Stormlight, and for what reasons? I'm kind of confused, because I'm under the impression that unless you have Surge Binders, or Fabrials, which require Spren, which as far as I know cannot go to other planets, like they're stuck on Roshar. So unless you have like all of these things that are specific to Roshar, I think Stormlight is just like a light source. Like, I mean, sure, that would be neat to have glowing rocks, but like, who cares? I could be wrong. We could discover that Stormlight is actually harnessable through technology instead of just surge binding. Or maybe Stormlight can be used to power other forms of investiture as well. Maybe you can awaken something on Nolthis using Stormlight instead of Breath. Maybe you can use up Stormlight instead of metal reserves to do Allomancy on Scadrial. I don't know. Certainly Nightblood can feast on Stormlight just as easily as he can on Breath, but Nightblood I think just generally feeds on any kind of investiture, so I don't think that's really relevant. The other thing that's interesting here is that Mraiz tells Shallan that someone who is heavily invested with the investiture of one world generally cannot go to other worlds, and this raises two questions. Question number one is Hoid, and question number two, spoilers ahead for Mistborn Secret History, the Ire. So Hoid and the Ire are both heavily invested in certain planets. Hoid at this point is invested in Scadrial, Nolthis, and Roshar at the least. I don't think he ever managed to get invested on Sel. Whereas the Ire are specifically invested on Sel. They're Elantrians. And yet they move between worlds. Now, we don't know if the Ire can move to the physical world of Scadrial, or if they're stuck in the cognitive realm. But if they can move, I'm guessing that this might be the reason why they're kind of messed up. Like the Ire are all, from what I remember, they're kind of like old and sunken in and wrinkly and stuff, and they have to drink like a weird silvery liquid to like maintain themselves. I think this might be because they're so far away from Sel, and therefore so far away from the door, which is their source of investiture. And the thing that sort of keeps them alive, really, as Elantrians. I think that might be what's going on there. As for Hoid, I don't know. For all I know, Hoid just doesn't follow any of the rules of the Cosmere. I mean, he does weird stuff all the time. Maybe he's like the one guy who can move from planet to planet despite being heavily invested. I genuinely don't know. But I do just want to acknowledge that is like that. I don't want to say it's a plot hole, because I'm sure Sanderson has thought of it. It's just something that feels like a plot hole right now and requires an explanation, which is, how does Hoid get around? What else can I talk about here? Oh yeah, this book is kind of weird. This is a weird segue, but this book is kind of weird. So the reason this book is kind of weird is because it appears that an entire book's worth of events happened off screen between the last book and this one. Like, the previous books were fairly close together, and then this one had a big time skip, which I did predict back in Dawnshard. But, like, during that time skip, Kaladin has developed a personal rivalry with Leshwi. He also dated Lynn for a while. Everyone knows about Veil and Radiant now, and everyone just is aware that Shallan has 3 personas. Yalai Sadeas was leading the Sons of Honor somehow. There's just a lot going on. Like, there's just Navani made an airship. There's just a ton that happened between these two books that just... Why wasn't any of that in a book? I'm not necessarily complaining, I'm sure there's a good reason, but right now it just seems weird that at least some of that stuff that I just listed did not actually happen in an actual book. Oh, also there's like so many Radiants now. Like they have a bunch of what are they called? A bunch of edge dancers, a bunch of really every kind of Radiant as far as I can tell. Which, okay, cool. Where'd they come from? How'd they bond Spren? Were they someone's squires? Did Lift have squires at some point? How terribly did that go? I need to know. Anyway, that was just something I wanted to talk about, sort of the structure of the book that strikes me as a bit odd. The other thing that strikes me as a bit odd is that apparently when it was revealed in the last book that singers predate humans on Roshar, what every character seems to have taken from that is that Honor was the god of the singers and Odium was the god of the humans. And I guess that's true because we're just supposed to accept it as fact now, but that's not how I interpreted that. Like, my understanding was that both Honor and Odium and probably Cultivation all came with the humans to Roshar, which was inhabited by the singers and did not have a shard. At least that was my understanding, but apparently I was wrong. So maybe my theory that the humans came from Yolin and that the disaster that happened was the shattering of Adonalsium is also wrong. Because apparently this all happened a long time after Adonalsium was shattered because, well, apparently Honor already had his own planet. What else do I even have to say here? Right, there's also some interesting... I'm just gonna end on like, my favorite topic, which is queer readings of Stormlight Archive. So, first of all, the Fused don't care about the sex of the body they reincarnate into. This is really neat. Leshwi spends this entire section of the book in a male body. And this is only acknowledged once and as an aside, and otherwise no one cares, no one comments on it, everyone sees her as who she is and refers to her with female pronouns, and there is no confusion about this, which is cool. The other thing that's interesting here is there's what I'm going to interpret as a confirmation that Veil, at least, is bisexual. I still think Shallan is as well, because I think Shallan had like a bit of a baby crush on Yasna last book. But even if Shallan herself is not, Veil is, because Kaladin at one point asks, is there anyone who doesn't like smart girls? And Veil says, me. Give me dumb ones, please. They're much easier to impress. And obviously this is like kind of a plausible deniability thing. Like you could say that this isn't actually about like sex or romance, but come on. That's clearly a comment that's meant to be like Veil is into girls. So I'm just treating Veil as canonically bisexual from this point on. And finally, there is no heterosexual explanation for some of the interactions that happen here between Cal and Adeline. When Cal has his whole despair moment, Syl wants to help him. And who does she fetch to cheer him up? Does she fetch one of his close friends from Bridge 4? One of the people who he values more than anything else in the world? Does he fetch his fellow Radiant, Shallan, who is a close friend and also someone he had a bit of a crush on? No, she fetches Adolin Colin, who shows up, and the first thing that Kaladin comments on in his internal monologue is how he hates how good-looking Adolin is. He's like something, where does he get off having such perfect hair? Or something like that. And like, Brandon, what are you doing? What am I supposed to do with this, Brandon? Again, I'm not saying that this is going to happen. I'm sure it's not. I'm sure now that Adolin and Shallan have tied the knot, they're gonna be together forever because Mormonism. But I'm just saying, Kaladin definitely, like, factually has a crush on Adolin. And I'm pretty sure it's reciprocal, because Adolin also talks very lovey-dovey to Kaladin. There is no way to interpret some of the stuff Adolin says to Kaladin here except as flirting, in my opinion. So yeah, I'm just putting that out there. Yeah, I think that's all I'm gonna talk about for now. Oh wait, I forgot to talk about something very important. Never mind. Back to Cosmere plot connections. Okay, how do I put this without sounding insane? Fabrials are allomantic? Apparently? Like, the way Fabrials work is by using different metals that have different effects on the spren inside the Fabrial, and the effects that the different metals have match up basically one-to-one with those metals' allomantic powers on Scadrial. So bronze will make a warning Fabrial. Like it warns you if there's an Allomancer nearby. Pewter will make will augment or strengthen the effect of something, which I wonder what pewter does. Zinc and brass will either raise or lower the spren's emotional state, I guess, which will then affect the spren's element. Iron is used to create attractor Fabrials. And Navani says that they don't know how to make repulsor Fabrials because they don't know what metal to make them out of. It's steel. It's steel, Navani. Make them out of steel. Trust me, it'll work. So yeah, just wanted to... I don't know what to make of this. Oh, also aluminum continues to function basically the same throughout the Cosmere, which is that aluminum just seems to kind of block investiture. And because aluminum is silvery, and it's always described as silvery in the books as well, I now have a, let's say, crackpot theory, but I'm going to say that I'm actually fairly confident in it, that once we get a book set on Threnody, we are going to discover that the silver that is used in Shadows for Silence in the Forests of Hell is actually aluminum. I have a very strong feeling that is the case. Now, as for what all this means for the Cosmere as a whole, I have no idea. But I'm just acknowledging that it's really cool. And finally, I'm going to give a prediction on something that I don't think is very important, but I'm going to just throw it out there. I think that the Ghost Blood who killed Ioli Sadeas is Ishna. I don't have any strong arguments for this other than the fact that she wanted to join the Ghost Bloods. But that's gonna be my guess for right now. Let's see if that's correct. Oh, and a correction for something I said in a previous video. I said when I heard that Braze is damnation, I kind of made the mistake of projecting sort of Christian concepts of heaven and hell onto this. And so I assumed that that meant that Braze was probably the fiery planet. But of course, if I'd actually checked back in Arcanum Unbounded, I would know Braze is the ice planet. So Damnation is the ice planet, which is inhabited by Spren. And Ashen, the fire planet, is apparently the Tranquillan Halls. I'm very curious to see how that works, because based on Chris's description, it doesn't sound like a good place to be. Yeah, I don't know. I don't know about that one, Chief. So I'm going to, oh boy, this was a long video, but it was one video. Congratulations to me. I'm going to go and start reading Rhythm of War Part 2. See you next time when I finish that. Bye!